Good afternoon. Buenos dias, buenos dias. Thank you all very much for being with us today. Good afternoon and welcome everyone to the Wilson Center. My name is Eddie Acevedo and I'm the Chief of Staff and Senior Advisor here at the Center. The Wilson Center is congressionally chartered, scholarship driven, and fiercely nonpartisan and independent. Our special status brings with it certain obligations to prioritize the most important issues and opportunities, and to do so in a way where we can make a difference, shape the world, and offer recommendations to policymakers. With that in mind, we turn our attention today to our closest neighbors and allies in Latin America. The United States is Latin America's largest trading partner, and the region is home to ample amounts of natural resources. As of 2022, the trade of U.S. goods and services with the Western Hemisphere totaled $2.4 trillion. In fact, Mexico is now the U.S. top trading partner around the world, surpassing China. Yet Latin America is still plagued by authoritarian regimes, corruption, influence of nefarious actors like Iran, Russia, and China. On a recent trip to the region last month, Ambassador Green, the president and CEO of the center, and myself, we traveled to Panama and to Costa Rica. We were very honored that President Duque was with us in Panama. And one of the things that we did was to tour a little bit of the Darien region, where we learned firsthand that about 70% of the migrants coming through the Darien region right now are Venezuelans. And when we had the opportunity to speak to the migrants, we asked them one very simple question: why are you leaving Venezuela? And all of them gave the same answer, which was Maduro. Maduro stole the elections, and therefore we are fleeing Venezuela. It's a very sad and tragic story of what's happening in Venezuela. One of the things that I like to point out a lot in many of my discussions is that right now Venezuela is the largest humanitarian refugee and migration crisis around the world. A lot of people, it's difficult, I think, for Americans to understand this and to rationalize this, because we assume that that would be like a Ukraine or a Gaza situation where there is active military conflict. Instead, we have it in this hemisphere. We have it in Venezuela, when nearly about 8 to 9 million Venezuelans have left their native homeland for over a decade. So we're very honored to have this distinguished panel with us today to be able to offer some recommendations of what is going on in this region. You know, I think a lot of times this region gets neglected, unfortunately, and sometimes in the US we end up taking it for granted. But a lot of our prosperity as a nation comes from our ties to this region. A lot of our cultural ties come through this region. We're obviously in the middle of celebrating Hispanic Heritage Month in the US. And I think one of the things that we try to do here at the Wilson Center through our Latin America program and through our Iván Duque Center is to celebrate, but also acknowledge the work and the importance of this region, not only to the US, but worldwide. The Wilson Center is proud that today's event is being brought to us by the Iván Duque Center for Prosperity and Freedom, and we're lucky that today President Duque is with us. Thank you, Mr. President. I also want to give a very special recognition to a group of young students who are here, who are part of President Duque's foundation, la Fundación Innovación para el Desarrollo. Muchas gracias a los estudiantes que están aquí con nosotros. And to kick things off, it is my pleasure to introduce Chile's ambassador to the U.S., Juan Gabriel Valdez. Ambassador Valdez has led a long career of public service, serving as Chile's ambassador to the U.S., to the United Nations, to Argentina, and to Spain, and formerly was the Minister of Foreign Affairs for Chile from 1999 to 2000. So thank you so much, and Ambassador Valdez, the floor is yours.
Mr. President, it's a pleasure to be with you today. Andres, dear friends, students in particular. I would like to express my gratitude to Andres Rugeles for inviting me to participate in the presentation of this remarkable and essential book on Latin America, The Vision of Its Leaders. This is a special day for me, apart from everything, because it's our National Day of Independence, September 18th. And therefore, I came to celebrate the friendship between Colombia and Chile. This book could not come at a better time. Behind the immense effort of gathering this valuable collection of interviews and articles lies not only an invitation to reflect on a region that is losing importance in today's world, where the safeguards provided by the multilateral system and international law have significantly weakened, where economic growth is barely minimal, and where the wealth distribution problem constantly exposes the region to political instability. It is not just, as I said, an invitation to reflect. It is also a call to act collectively as the only way to face the growing global challenges. During the past decade, the region has not advanced but rather regressed in terms of regional integration. One after another, the regional instruments designed to promote integration, even governmental dialogue, have faded or died. Some have been definitely buried, while others survive as hollow frameworks. A decisive factor in this failure has been the belief that integration requires an ideological perspective. That dialogue is only possible if we share the same convictions, the same vision of economic development, and sometimes the same tariff policies. Another negative factor has been the refounding spirit that has led many governments to believe that everything must start from scratch. But there is something more, I believe, the lack of will and the loss of faith in the idea that this Latin American region has a shared destiny. In losing this cultural sense of integration, we have taken steps backward. When Andres asked me to reflect on integration, I recalled that long-forgotten document from 1968 called the Viña del Mar Consensus, el Consenso de Viña del Mar, signed by all Latin American countries, from Mexico to Argentina. Allow me to read its opening paragraph. The member countries, affirm the distinct identity of Latin America, the development process in the region, and the transformations taking place in each of our countries, together with the changes occurring globally, demand significant adjustments in the nature of Latin America's relationship with the rest of the international community. These ministers and presidents in the 60s were prepared to negotiate as a region, to make progress in the integration of the region and in a new fruitful relationship with the United States and with the European community. That collective will to move forward has been lost or needs to be restored. I see this book and the debate it should spark as an opportunity to reignite that flame. I believe that to achieve this, a practical spirit is required. We need to be more pragmatic, to propose fewer but reachable objectives. But we have always to remember that at the same time, that pragmatism without principles is a recipe for disasters. There is no conceivable reason why Latin American governments should not establish permanent mechanisms for coordination and joint efforts in areas such as pandemics, natural disasters, organized crime, and the fight to preserve the environment and combat global warming, for example. These are very serious matters and demand high-level dialogue, require cooperation between governments, regardless of their ideologies. Moreover, They hold enormous importance for our citizens. Simply witnessing men and women from our region come to aid to a neighboring country in the midst of a tragedy is a civilizing act with profound positive political consequences. Today, we do not have that organization. But I conclude with this. It is not enough to approach integration pragmatically. It is also necessary to consider some essential principles without which the progressive convergence of our countries, the sense that we are in the same boat facing immense difficulties in the modern world, loses meaning. The most fundamental principles are the absolute respect for human rights and the firm commitment to a democratic regime. In this context, we must appreciate the response of the majority of our region in defense of Venezuelan democracy and the condemnation of the electoral fraud and brutal repression unleashed by the Maduro regime against the Venezuelan people. The convergence of governments of different ideological orientations in support of the Venezuelan cause demonstrates that our dialogue towards more integration is possible and could go well beyond our shared responsibilities simply to address disasters and climate threats. When we look at examples like our common and autonomous reaction in front of the Venezuelan cause, we realize that indeed this region has its own identity. It only needs the guidance, the strength, and the leadership to go forward. The work we discussed today and is going to be commented today is an instrument of great interest in giving it renewed momentum. I thank once again his author and those who have invited me to be here today. Thank you very much.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. And before we go to the panel, I would like to make some comments in general, and then we will start the discussion in the panel. And so, good afternoon, President Iván Duque, Ambassador Juan Manuel Valdés, Rebecca, Felipe Jaramillo, Eddie Acevedo, Adriana Mejia, special guest, friends all. I would like to thank the Iván Duque Center for Prosperity and Freedom at the Wilson Center for this invitation to present my book, Latin America, the Vision of Its Leaders. I congratulate you for taking the initiative to generate this space for reflection in an academic environment on the future challenges of Latin America. I'm convinced that these exercises need to be carried out on a recurring basis and in a plural, comprehensive, and balanced spirit. What lies ahead in the coming years is no small thing. This is what the mega trends that in the book are studied and explained show us. We must be prepared to face the challenges and overcome them successfully. Only to the extent that we have the diagnostics, but especially the answers to an increasingly uncertain future, we will be able to build the right paths from public policy as well as increasing democratic, prosperous, and inclusive societies. This requires work, effort, and thought. And this requires political will, vision, and decision. The starting point of this book was an ever-present question: where is Latin America heading? The result is reflected in 30 interviews with leaders in the region that are part of the book, in the 55 articles written especially for this volume by leading authorities, experts, and academics, and in the 92 pages written at the University of Oxford and the London School of Economics. A total of 106 personalities participated whose contributions reflected intellectual depth, geographical diversity, political and ideological plurality, gender balance, and generational equilibrium. This book revolves around 6 thematic axes: poverty and inequality, growth and productivity, environment, democracy, regional integration, and international affairs or international insertion of Latin America. These reveal pending tasks, aspirations, and key fronts of work for the future of the region, also potential risk in the journey through history. Like the cogs in a wheel, these are elements that drive each other, and understanding them is a key to successfully address them in 3 dimensions: national, regional, and global. This work, more than the result of an academic exercise, is intended to be a collective contribution, a sort of a regional public good to think Latin America in the present and in the future, and finding answers to its main challenges. The question of the future and successful participation of countries and regions in the world economy is also being asked in other parts of the world, especially in the global south. For example, India is directing its efforts towards building its own way. They call it the Indian way, which prioritizes intensive investment in human capital, the provision of high-skilled services and innovation in new manufacturing products, and its future is based on knowledge and creativity. Goldman Sachs projections point to India being the 2nd largest economy after China by 2075. In this context, Latin America must also pave its own path towards what I call the Latin American way. However, we find ourselves immersed in a global scenario that resembles an endless hurricane with immeasurable speeds. Uncertainty seems to be the new normal. The former British minister, Gordon Brown, has summed it up in one word: perma-crisis, understood as an extended period of instability and insecurity resulting from a series of catastrophic events. We are, as a humanity, and this is something that we underline in the book, in a profound process of what we call an epochal change, cambio de época, which is a turning point. The convulsion of the world is not at random, nor is fragility, fragmentation, and polarization. We are, as what we call, in a cold peace phase. And this is something that we have stated at the Colombian Council on Foreign Affairs. We live among tectonic plates that move simultaneously in different directions. And in this regard, it is possible to identify the following 6 trends. The first one, new geopolitics and geoeconomics. Second, democracy is ever more fragile. Third, we are facing a triple global crisis: food, fuel, and financial. Fourth, the projections of economic growth are becoming more weak. The fifth one, climate change and water challenges. Today, more than 3,000 million people are suffering from water. And the sixth one is weapons of mass destruction and the use of new technologies. Latin America arrives at this epochal change in a fragile and divided state with different development traps in terms of social, economic productivity, environmental, institutional, and governance issues. It has lost relative importance in the world, and the quality of its external insertion has deteriorated. Despite all the changes, I remain on the optimistic side. This feeling brings energy, drive, creativity, innovation. Latin America has the potential to become a region of solutions given its enormous wealth. It has a role to play and capital to contribute to natural resources, raw materials, climate change, clean energy, and food. Indeed, the Amazon absorbs a quarter of the planet's CO2. We have 60% of the world's lithium reserves. We can feed 1.3 billion people, and in the 2050, we can feed 9 billion people. And we are the most dynamic region after India in terms of venture capital and unicorns. In short, we have what other countries and blocs need and crave to compete effectively in a global, green, and digital economy. And I believe that the opportunity Latin America has cannot be wasted. It requires a renewed leadership. The region has the imperative to build long-term visions, think big, act pragmatically, and construct broad consensus on the structural reforms needed to ensure a more prosperous and inclusive future. Latin America and its leaders must take advantage of all opportunities available today. The work carried out in this book is directly and precisely directed in that direction. And as a way of Twitter, let me point out 6 big messages of the book. The first one is that we need to seek for a new social contract based on sectoral pacts and a restricted adherence to democracy. The second one is that we need to move from ideology to action for the construction of a development model that prioritizes productive transformation under the green, digital, and inclusive formula, the GDI. The third, we need to achieve more climate action and stop the rhetoric of the COP conferences. Fourth, we are facing democratic disenchantment that flirts with a dangerous what if, which opens the door to the autocrats 2.0. Fifth, we need to deepen the possible path for regional integration with pragmatism and without ideologies. Sixth, we need to build a Latin American way of insertion in the world that gives privileges to a renewed multilateralism and strengthens our voice, and simultaneously we can have a relationship with the United States, with China, with the European Union, with India, and the Global South. Within this framework of this event at the Wilson Center, I would like to make a comment, and a final comment, on democracy and the emerging political risk in the region. And what we have observed recently in Venezuela is disturbing. And let me make it very clear. What happened in Venezuela is a coup d'etat by a regime that is becoming more autocratic, violent, corrupt, and linked with international crime, drugs, and illegal mining. The dictator Maduro broke all the basic norms of democracy, freedom, and institutional check and balances. His only purpose is to keep himself in power, following the Nicaraguan and the Cuban model of repression. The door is open for more human rights violations, the commission of crimes against humanity, political persecution, and the material destruction of an entire nation. And let me ask this, is this the future that we want for Venezuela? The international community and the United States cannot allow this. They cannot be complicit in this situation. They cannot tolerate that the dictator put the peace and security of Latin America at risk. It is necessary to act under the strict compliance of the international law and recognize the victory of the opposition and to carry out a democratic transition. The peace and democracy of Venezuela is the peace and democracy of Colombia and the region. And from a regional perspective, I would like to add that today in Latin America, there is a growing democratic disenchantment. What used to be indifference has turned into disaffection. we are facing a process that is creeping towards a democratic recession. Latinobarometer figures indicate this. We are facing the emergence of the autocrats 2.0, as I analyze in the book. These are populists on the left and on the right, who have arisen from anger and have fanatical promoters. Their modus operandi is the same. They come to power by electoral means, but once they are inside the system, they take a charge of eroding the institutions to establish themselves in power indefinitely and arbitrarily. Freedom House warns that tyrannical leaders are increasingly collaborating with each other to redefine and expand their methods of repression while rejecting internal and external democratic pressure. And this situation is aggravated by new political risk associated with limited governance in the face of social fragmentation, a reduced capacity of the state to meet the growing demands of the population, and a panorama of toxic levels of polarization in which political parties do not manage to maintain the support of their citizens and are trapped by clientelist interest. At the bottom of the spiral, there is a low level of trust among population in their institutions and leaders. And besides, there is a widespread corruption that weakens the social contract and diverts resources from investment needed for sustainable and inclusive development. This matrix has an additional component to make it more complex. Organized crime and drug trafficking networks are generating high levels of violence and insecurity, and that is corroding the rule of law. There is no doubt that illicit economies are one of the main sources of instability for achieving a peaceful coexistence between and within countries. The democratic and peaceful future of the region depends on effective action against these criminal networks, which have demonstrated enormous flexibility, dynamism, and adaptability to change. In a few words, Latin America states or countries need to implement comprehensive methods and coordination mechanisms to prevent and combat the various forms of organized crime. This approach should prevail both domestically and internally. Dear friends, I would like to conclude these words by expressing my deep and sincere gratitude to all of those who supported each of the phases of this project. Also, I want to thank for the valuable contributions of many dear leaders, experts, and academics, as well as institutions, development banks, universities, and think tanks that are based in Washington. My special thanks to President Duque for his support, to Felipe Jaramillo, to Inter-American Dialogue in this project. And the task of writing this book has been carried out with conviction, rigor, and with enormous social commitment. And this is why I decided to donate all the royalties from this book to the Colombianitos Foundation that works in benefit for vulnerable girls and boys through education and sports as a powerful tools for social inclusion. I'm convinced that the region must advance in the construction of its own path for sustainable development and integration. And that will open the doors to a greater prosperity and freedom. I invite you to believe in Latin America, to work for its well-being, and to persist to achieve it. The key for its democratic future is in our hands, and is only in our hands. Thank you very much. Well, so are you ready for the panel?
Ready?
Yeah.
Let's see.
So the idea is to make 2 rounds,
Okay.
and then you have the third round would be a very short question. It's a surprise question, I call it. Okay? So
Okay.
So let's start.
I know.
Are you ready?
Let's start with Felipe. And let me ask you, what do you think, how can Latin American countries escape from the middle income trap, and what governments and private sector should do about it? Let's go 5 minutes.
Thank you. I'll try to be shorter. Okay, you're asking a question about which a lot has been written. The World Bank just came out with its annual World Development Report, and it's about the middle income trap. But the middle income trap is an old idea, and it's that somehow countries manage to grow up to a certain level, and then they stagnate, they plateau, they can't keep going. Very few, if any, countries really in the last 40 years have been able to rise from poverty to being in the club of wealthy countries. I think the most striking example for me, a country I visited a couple of times, is Korea. When you rank Korea in 1960 with Latin America, Korea was at the bottom, along with Nicaragua and Honduras, lowest per capita income. And you look at Korea 20 years later, today, and Korea is a very wealthy country, richer than any country in Latin America. And Korea did that in 25 years. And yet we are stuck, for the most part, in the middle income trap. I'll tell you, the key reason is low productivity growth. Low growth. Our Latin America region, every time you look at the growth tables, you look at what's going on in East Asia, you look at what's going on in South Asia, you look at even what's going on in Africa, and our growth rates are, on the average, the lowest. And they have been for decades, sadly. Low productivity growth, I would say, is two reasons. Number one is stagnated technology, and number two, skills education. I'll say something on the skill side. On the technology. Why is it that Latin American companies are laggards in technology and productivity? I think most of our studies show many things, but the main one is that there's no real competition in most of our markets. Our markets are very concentrated in relatively few large, powerful companies, and then millions of tiny informal firms that have very low productivity. And those large companies usually have protected markets. There's tariffs and non-tariff barriers that do not allow goods to enter the market to compete with them, and they're not encouraged to export. They're not encouraged to export, which is exactly what Korea did. Korea had a model which was, we are going to conquer world markets. We're going to go and compete. We're going to get the latest technologies. So that, I think, is our biggest problem. The positive side is that Latin America does very well in agriculture and in minerals. We've always been huge exporters of course, coffee, bananas, fruits from Chile, and from the other countries, wheat, soybeans, beef from Argentina, from Uruguay, from Brazil. Minerals, of course, copper, and now everybody's very excited about lithium. But when I was growing up and I was going to school and learning about development, the problem my teachers always told me is we only export raw materials. We cannot seem to go to the next level. And here we are 30, 40 years later, same problem. I will end by saying that Latin America now has an opportunity. I think we have all heard about it, called nearshoring, which is many foreign companies looking for places to invest, to diversify their exporting platforms. And Latin America is uniquely positioned in close to the largest market in this hemisphere, the US, uniquely positioned to capitalize on that. And I have to say, so far, I'm not impressed. The numbers are very low. The countries really need to make a big effort to attract this investment and the jobs that they would generate. Thank you, Andres, and congratulations on this great work. I'm already enjoying it.
Yeah. Thank you very much, and thank you for your article. Then next question is about your article. Rebecca, we have talked today about democracy, do you think that democracy in decline in Latin America, are the authoritarian regimes coming back, and what the international community should do about it?
Thank you, and Andres, thank you so much for having me. I think there's a lot of kind of negative things to say about the state of democracy in the region, but I do want to say one thing that I think is, when we're thinking about ways to address the decline in democratic institutions, goes back to what Ambassador Valdez said and the importance of the region coming together. We saw the power of that in the case of Guatemala, when there was a concerted effort to prevent Bernardo Arevalo from assuming the presidency. We saw the OAS take a lead role. We saw the countries of the region really come together, and it made a difference. So I did want to start by saying that. You yourself, when you were talking about the trends, democracy is one that you pointed out, and I have to say I agree with you fully. I think we're not prepared to deal with the nature of the challenges today. They're very different than they were in the past. We're still kind of in the third wave of democracy, and I think we are not prepared for the reverse wave that we're seeing. In part, I think, because it's no longer an abrupt change in the constitutional order where you see something like a military coup. Instead, it's what I think you even use these words. It's this dismantling of democratic institutions. So someone's elected to power, they get into power, and then they in a very deliberate manner, dismantle institutions that are so essential for the rule of law, eliminating any agency of horizontal accountability. And you also made the point that I think is really important, is this is happening but governments from both the left and the right are doing this. And I think from a policy perspective and what to do about this, and this would be a recommendation to the US government, is instead of focusing on whether or not, on the ideology of a government, whether it's conservative or whether it's on the left or the right, we should be really focusing on where it is on the democracy, the liberal democracy continuum. I think that should be what's really driving US policy. I think that there's a playbook out there. I think there was this idea that the authoritarians are actually working together in many cases, or sharing best practices. And it's really been perfected. And I think it's speeding up. And I think we see this most clearly in Bukele's El Salvador, where the decline is so rapid. And we see things like one of the first things that happens is the dismantling of judicial autonomy. Or in the case of Mexico, it's the last thing. It was pretty much, you look at the judiciary, and it's been one of the last lines of defense for democracy. And this typically involves manipulating the institutional design of the courts. So it can't fulfill its constitutional role as a check. And in many cases, we'll see in Mexico, but it's the changing the appointment process can be very problematic. And it can allow the president to pack the courts with cronies. Another, I think, common tool is to chip away at freedom of expression. And we're seeing this, this is an essential civil liberty. The ability of the opposition to express discontent with the government without fear. I think when confronting this, I do see a role for the hemispheric community. I think perhaps what we need to do, and I know there's been a real effort in the OAS to revive the Inter-American Democratic Charter. When it was written with the military coup, this abrupt break. And I think that there's been a real effort to think about what are some of the early warning signs of democratic decline. And even I would think that even kind of coming up with what these are, and as much as we can come together as a region and keep track of those. But I think your point, I think everyone so far, well, Ambassador Valdez and you in particular have talked about Venezuela and the tragic situation there. There are three full-blown dictatorships in the hemisphere, and we can't, of course, overlook that.
Thank you very much, Rebecca. And Felipe, you wrote a very interesting article for the book on education. And why you don't tell us a little bit more about why you think that education is the main challenge for the region and how we should move forward?
Okay.
And 3 minutes, okay?
Yes, very short. It's simple, so I don't need much time. So you put together this, and so this is the challenge of the region. There's a lot. But But you pressed me to say, choose one.
Yeah.
And I chose education. Because, as I said, our problem is low growth, low productivity. And so it's about poor technology, poor education.
Yeah.
Why do we have poor education? I don't know the reason, but it's very sad. I mean, if you go to Korea and you go see the schools and you see how the kids are being tested, the teachers are teaching, it's unbelievable. They now are at the top of the tables in terms of reading comprehension. We did a survey not too long ago and asked lots of Latin Americans, if you test an average child, a simple 2-sentence, read and answer a question about that text. Can you read it and can you understand it? How many do you think would fail that test? And most people thought that on average 20 to 25% would fail. They thought that about 75% would do well. The reality back 2-3 years ago when we had the data was over 50% failed that test. Unfortunately, over the last year we've done new tests, and because of the pandemic and the amount of kids that did not go to school for about 2 years, we're talking now about 80% of the kids cannot understand a simple text at age 10. Now, this is key because if you have children that receive very poor education, the bulk of public education, you're not going to have growth. You're not going to have the skills you need to confront a world economy. And second, you're only going to reproduce the high levels of inequality that we've inherited from the past. We are the most unequal region, and a big chunk of it is because the majority of the kids go to public schools that are very bad in quality. And if they don't know how to read, it's going to be very difficult to get out there. Now, the positive side of this story is that this can be fixed. Korea did it, Taiwan did it, China has done it, Vietnam has done it. They're all now getting higher test scores in the PISA tests than most Latin American countries. This can be done, but I see very few leaders in Latin America willing to tackle that problem. It's absolutely key. Thank you.
Very good. Rebecca,
Yes.
do you think that the U.S. is losing ground in Latin America versus China? And what do you think that what are the core issues for a renewed U.S.-LATAM agenda?
Okay, so 3 minutes. Can I spend my first minute just, your point about education made me think of something else
Yes,
about
yes,
democracy. So I'm just and it also relates to your question. I think one of the other best defenses against authoritarian decline or kind of this creeping authoritarianism is increasing, as you mentioned, the lack of faith, the reduction in faith in democracy is the best form of government. And this is going to require that democracies deliver the basic needs of their people, whether it's the ability to send their kids to school safely or provide a decent education to the kids. China, yes. And I think Eddie, the way he started out this morning's discussion, by pointing out that the U.S. does not pay enough attention to the region, I think that's partly why the U.S. is facing such a challenge from China in the region. I think it's real. But I do want to say, just really quickly preface my comments, is that the challenges posed by China are real. And they have to be factored into any sort of regional strategy, which of course, this is assuming the U.S. has a coherent regional strategy towards the region. That has to be factored into a regional strategy, but I also want to kind of warn against that it should not be the only catalyst for U.S. engagement, because we've fallen into that trap before during the Cold War and looking at the region only as a theater of conflict rather than an area for true cooperation and partnership. But what I would say is that China, as everyone in this room knows, has been gaining ground for the past 2 years. And the U.S., in part, it's because the U.S. has taken its economic leverage over Latin America for granted and has just taken the region for granted. So the only way to handle this is to compete effectively with China. It's not to force or to try to force the countries of the region to make a choice between the U.S. and China. It's to provide an alternative. And this is going to require a real commitment on the part of the U.S. And I hope either a Harris administration or a Trump administration comes in, prioritizes the region, recognizes this challenge, and develops a coherent strategy that offers alternatives to the region, whether it be by putting some real teeth into the America's Partnership for Economic Prosperity, helping make nearshoring a reality. But this is not just a region of challenges. This is a region of opportunities. There's so many positives in the region, and I think that my hope is that President Harris or President Trump recognizes this and develops a coherent strategy of engagement with the region, positive engagement with the region that provides alternatives.
That's very good. And let's go with the last round with the surprise question. and you mentioned a lot of Trump and Kamala. And for you, Rebecca, Trump or Kamala?
So we're fiercely nonpartisan at the Inter-American Dialogue, just like the Wilson Center. I think you could just look at my bio and see, but that's, I think, we're a fiercely nonpartisan organization, just like the Wilson Center. But I served in the Obama administration, and I'm going to just leave it at that.
Okay. Good. That's good. Felipe.
I don't like that question.
Felipe, no, when you think about the future of Latin America, and if you have to define the future of the region in one word, which one would be that word?
Wow. I'm so glad you didn't ask me the Trump versus Kamala question, because I was going to vote for President Duque here. In one word, listen, right now, what I would say, given the polarization that I see everywhere, I would like to put forward dialogue. Dialogue. We need to talk amongst each other. We need to come to agreements. People are screaming at each other right now, and I'm very concerned about what the state of public dialogue in the whole region right now.
Very good. So I close this dialogue with more dialogue for the region, and thank you very much, and please, and a big applause for that. And now we invite President Duque to give the final remarks. The floor is yours, President.
Well, thank you so much, Dr. Rugeles, Carlos Felipe. It's great to see you again. Rebecca, thank you so much. Ambassador Valdez, distinguished guests, dreamers and makers from the I+D Foundation, Adriana, and friends all. I think this has been an amazing opportunity to witness what I consider a major analysis, because Andres Rugeles has been devoting the last years to accomplish this work, which is a new release. But I'm also glad to say that it's a new release that is going to become immediately a classic. And the reason why I say this is because he has been able to invite multiple leaders from different ideological spectrums, intellectuals, academics, people that have been working in development banking, and also those who have become ideological promoters of solutions in Latin America. I think it's very difficult to accomplish a work in which so many people with such intellectual strength have decided to participate in one volume of analysis. And I think anyone who wants to study Latin America will definitely need to have this book in his or her bookshelf. So congratulations for that, Andres. I want to say that when I think of Latin America, sometimes I debate about those gloomy perspectives of the region. And I had that kind of a debate in Oxford with Andres and many members of faculty from different areas. Because when we asked about what was the forecast for Latin America, many people were very gloomy. It's a noisy region. It's a region with a lot of political unrest. It's a region where there's permanent corruption scandals. Those were things that came out in the conversations. But I think it's important that we reflect on something that Gabriel Garcia Marquez used to say, and is that Latin Americans, we don't take time to celebrate our successes. And when we look at the history of Latin America, at least in the last 40 years, what we have seen is the fastest expansion ever of the middle class in the region. We have reached the highest levels of coverage in education and health, the highest numbers of investment in critical infrastructure, the highest levels of integration with the rest of the world in terms of exports and investment. And when we look at the Human Development Index in terms of the reduction of deaths at birth or the expansion of the life cycles, we have reached record numbers. And I think we have to celebrate that, because if we don't celebrate it, we're going to keep on opening the opportunity of those who love to make politics on the gloomy narrative in order to demolish many of the institutionals and the conquests that we have achieved. But we definitely also have to look at the challenges. And I think the challenges are very important. I believe there's a democratic setback, that it's been represented with what has been going on in Venezuela, what has been going on in Nicaragua. Obviously, Cuba is a permanent part of the story. But also we have seen setbacks recently, for example, with the judicial reform in Mexico. Not only because of the way that the majorities were assigned by the electoral authority in order to grant the coalition the possibility to reform the Constitution with a strong majority, that if it was based on a pure distribution of what the real results were, maybe that majority would not have been built the way that it has been shown to the public. And also the possibility of weakening the judicial system by making it extremely political. We can also see the cases of Bolivia, where the theory of re-election as a human right has been used to sustain power. And yes, we can talk about other cases where there have been democratic setbacks. And I think we should give attention to that. Because as Rebecca said, yes, we signed the Inter-American Democratic Charter in 2001, but it's sad to see that the region that signed that declaration has not enforced any mechanism at all in order to protect democracy where these setbacks are taking place. And I think we ought to do something about that. We have also to recognize, in terms of an accomplishment, that in the last 20 years, we have seen more countries become members of the OECD, and that's a positive signal of progress. Colombia is there, Costa Rica is there, Chile is there, Mexico was there, but now we see Brazil and Peru and others wanting to follow that line in order to give assurances that there is a permanent commitment on structural reforms, and that there is also a vocation in the region in order to build trust with the markets so that investment becomes a tool of economic growth, and thus economic growth will create better opportunities for our people. Those are things that we have to celebrate. But indeed, Carlos Felipe has mentioned something that is worrying. The last 5 years especially have shown that growth has stagnated. We're not growing at the levels we should grow. And yes, we live in a VUCA world of volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity. And we have to navigate those waters. But the best way to navigate those waters is to guarantee that we have a real market economy based on long-term regulation and stability in the rules of the game. and that we can integrate ourselves based on sharing those principles. And that obviously has to do with a question that has been asked here in this panel, and that is part of the reflections of the book. What can United States do with Latin America in order to strengthen the principles that we share? It's not that we depend on what the US wants to do with Latin America, but how can we build that dialogue and how can we produce the change we need in the region? And I have to say that the most important foreign policy that has ever been embraced by the US with Latin America has to do with free trade. When the free trade agreement was built with the Andean countries, with Central America and the DR, what was ensured was a permanent market with clear regulation in order to expand the possibilities of trade, to trigger the birth of new entrepreneurs and allow that birth of entrepreneurs to generate employment and make social transformations. It's sadly to say that in the United States, it seems that trade has become a polarized, ideologized policy. And I think the US cannot lose the perspective of the importance this has with Latin America. I said that here some weeks ago, that I saw the case of Ecuador. President Lasso wanted to move along to have a free trade agreement with the US, which was basically, and I'm just simplifying, a copy-paste of what could have been, or what is the free trade agreement between Colombia and the US, or Peru and the US, or Chile and the US. And there was no response because of the polarization and because trade seems to be something that generates too much of a conflict in the internal politics in the United States. So they never got a response back. But what happened was, 6 months down the road, Ecuador had signed a free trade agreement with China. So if the opportunity is lost, those opportunities are going to be capitalized by others. And something has to be done. And those reflections are also part of things that Enrique Iglesias said in his interview, the dialogue with Sebastián Piñera, the conversations with many presidents had to do with just that call. Let's strengthen free trade agreement between the US and Latin America. And yes, we can keep on discussing many of the things that have been said. But I want to highlight on the opportunities that Latin America has by itself, has for the United States, and has for the rest of the world. When we look at Latin America, we're looking at the superpower of biodiversity. Without Latin America, there's not going to be an efficient climate action policy for the planet. Not only because we have the Amazon, not only because we have 70% of the high altitude ecosystems, not only because we have a great part of the arable land in the planet, and not only because we have the largest share of biodiversity per unit of territory as a region in the planet. The US and the rest of the world needs Latin America with that capital. But that capital needs to be assessed and needs to have a value. And that's something that we discussed with Carlos Felipe when I was president of Colombia, that we should try to build, from an academic perspective, a gross biodiversity product. So we know what's the value of that asset and why preserving that asset, if it's valued, has to be reflected in the allocation of resources to protect that asset for the planet climate action needs. Second, nearshoring. But it's not just because nearshoring is a preventer of future massive migration, as sometimes it has been presented. It's because nearshoring allows to capitalize what is now one of the great assets of Latin America, and is that a great part of the population, more than 70% of the population in Latin America, it's below 45 years old. So there's an opportunity for us not only to use that human capital, but to make that human capital a massive production line that helps the big markets in the north, in this hemisphere, to be more secure, and not to be dependent on decisions from authoritarian regimes in other parts of the planet. Be close to market and be efficient and create aggregated value chains. And I will also highlight something that is very important. Latin America can become the Saudi Arabia of non-conventional renewable energy. And that non-conventional renewable energy is critical for the energy balance in the planet and the strengthening of the energy balance in the hemisphere. And we also have the minerals for the energy transition. Just the fact that we have more than 30% of the lithium world reserves allows us to think strategically. And my invitation to all of you is to read this book, to read these reflections, and try to create a dialogue that is not captured by ideology, or at least by ideological radicalism, but instead to focus on what the evidence tells us that a clear dialogue of opportunities should look like. And I will finish by saying this, that I liked about the book. I sometimes joke because when you see a book of that size, you will imagine that Andrés Rugeles was writing every day, doing interviews, but I was with him in Oxford, and I know that between interview and interview, there were a couple of gin and tonics. So I know that he played hard, he worked hard, and that's why we have this book. I definitely want to ask all of you to read the book. And the good thing about this book is that it can be read or read as Julio Cortázar described Rayuela. You can open any chapter you want. You don't have to read it in a linear way. You can pick the chapters that you like. But try to read it and enjoy it. Because most of the interviews, as sincere as sincerity can be, at least also from the academic and the political perspective of the leaders. And I invite you, Andrés, to keep on doing the world tour of the book. Because yesterday you were in Cali, now you're in Washington, tomorrow, I don't know if you're going to be in Madrid, Buenos Aires, you know. He's like a rock star, so he is moving all along the planet. I really want to invite you to read it, to share it, and to see this book as a permanent tool to understand Latin America. Congratulations, and for the Iván Duque Center here at the Wilson Center, having this kind of debates is critical. Carlos Felipe Jaramillo and me, we've been friends for a long time. I am always worried because every time I see him, my hair is whiter than his, and he's a little bit older than me. Not too much, but a little bit older than me, so he remains young. And Rebecca, thinking about the conversation that Carlos Felipe opened today on development policies, thinking about the role of middle-income countries, the role of institutions, I also want to encourage the Inter-American dialogue to open a debate that is needed. Along the things that worry me, one that worries me is that sometimes the democratic setbacks that we're seeing are hurting the technocratic institutions that have been built in Latin America for the last 3 decades. And that worries me a lot because we were able to build sound and also career technocracies. Correct. And it will take years to rebuild it, to rebuild that trust. And I think we have to give an opportunity to have that conversation. And this center is also open for that because we don't compete, we co-pete. We cooperate and compete sometimes. So thank you so much for being here this afternoon. Thank you, Andrés. Thank you for this great work that you have brought us. Thank you, Rebecca and Carlos Felipe, for your insights. And Ambassador Valdez, my respect and my admiration for you and your country, and especially in the Independence Day. Mm-hmm. And I want to say something. We can have ideological differences in Latin America, but what is also important is the things that we share. And I really want to express my recognition for the stand of President Boric and the Chilean government to defend democracy in Latin America and not to be tempted, but just try to be part of an ideological gang. So congratulations to all. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you, and thank you, President. And